The first snow came sideways across the Red Butte country. It did not fall gently. It scraped over the frozen ground in hard white sheets, filling wagon ruts, hiding stones, and pressing itself into every crack the wind could find. By noon, the hills had vanished. By evening, even the cottonwoods along Dry Creek were little more than gray shadows bending beneath the storm. Jonah Cade had seen worse winters. He had seen cattle freeze standing against a fence because the herd behind them would not let them turn. He had cut horses free from drifts so deep only their ears showed above the snow. He had crossed 5 miles of open range with a rope tied around his waist, dragging feed behind him because no wagon could move through the storm. Weather did not frighten him. It only gave him work. That morning, he broke ice from the trough before sunrise. He carried hay to the sheltered side of the barn, checked the hinges on the calving shed, and ran his hands along the legs of each horse to feel for swelling. He moved without hurry and without waste, as if the cold were simply another animal that needed handling. By mid-morning, frost had formed along his beard. He went into the bunkroom beside the barn and warmed his hands over a small iron stove. The room held a narrow cot, a wash basin, 3 pegs for his clothes, and a table scarred by knife marks. A coffee pot sat blackened on the stove. His breakfast plate from the day before remained where he had left it. 30 paces beyond the barn stood the cabin. It was larger than the bunkroom and built from squared pine logs Jonah had cut himself. There were 2 windows at the front, a stone chimney, and a porch roof that sagged slightly under the snow. No smoke had risen from that chimney in 7 years. Jonah kept the door locked. Each spring, he replaced loose shingles. Each autumn, he cleared dead grass from the foundation. He oiled the hinges, checked the glass, and swept snow away from the porch after every storm. He cared for the cabin the way a man might care for a grave. He never went farther inside than the doorway. On the afternoon the stranger came, Jonah was repairing a section of fence north of the creek. A cottonwood had dropped a heavy limb during the night, crushing 2 rails beneath it. He was cutting the last branch when he heard the distant ring of metal striking stone. At first, he thought it was a loose shoe on one of the horses. Then he heard it again. The sound came from the territorial road, half a mile east of his property. Jonah set down the axe and listened. The wind carried the faint creak of wheels. No sensible driver would have taken that road with the storm closing in. The nearest town was 14 miles south. The next ranch north lay nearly twice that distance away. He saddled his bay gelding and rode toward the sound. The stagecoach stood crooked in a drift near the bottom of a shallow ravine. One rear wheel had split at the hub. The driver and a young guard were trying to lash it together with rope, while the horses stamped and tossed their heads. A woman stood beside the coach. She wore a dark wool coat that was too thin for the country, and held a small leather trunk with both hands. Snow had gathered on the brim of her hat and along her shoulders. Her face was pale from cold, but she stood straight. The driver saw Jonah and lifted an arm. "Wheels done for," he called. "We can carry 1 passenger on a saddle horse, but not her trunk." Jonah looked at the woman. She looked back without lowering her eyes. The driver wiped snow from his mustache. "We passed Cade Ranch less than a mile back, did we not?" "You're on it," Jonah said. The woman's fingers tightened around the trunk handle. "My name is Eliza Warren," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried through the wind. "I was meant to meet my brother in Red Butte." Jonah said nothing. Eliza watched his face. "Samuel Warren," she added. The wind pushed between them. The driver bent again to the broken wheel. The guard pulled harder on the rope, pretending not to listen. Jonah had known Samuel Warren. Samuel had ridden beside him through 2 roundups and 3 winters. He had been quick with a rope, careless with money, and unable to pass a hungry animal without feeding it. In the spring, he had gone north with a trail herd. Only 11 riders returned. Samuel was not among them. Jonah had written a letter to the address found in Samuel's coat. He had sent the few dollars owed to him, and the silver watch Samuel carried. No answer had come. Eliza stood waiting. "When did you last hear from him?" Jonah asked. "February." The stage driver stopped pulling at the rope. Jonah looked past her toward the white road. The storm had already erased their tracks. "He died in April," Jonah said. Eliza did not move. The snow continued to gather on her hat. Jonah saw her take one slow breath, then another. How? Fever. After the drive. Was he alone? No. Her eyes closed for only a moment. The driver cleared his throat. "We have to make town before dark." Eliza looked toward the stagecoach, then at the road ahead. The driver would not take the trunk. The guard could barely keep his own saddle. Red Butte had one hotel, and Jonah knew every room was filled with railroad surveyors waiting out the weather. "Did Samuel leave anything?" she asked. "A knife, some clothes." "May I have them?" Jonah nodded. The driver climbed onto the coach box. "We can take you into Red Butte, ma'am. You will have to leave the trunk." Eliza looked down at it. The leather was cracked. One corner had been repaired with a strip of tin. It did not appear to contain much, but she held it as if all the life she had left was packed inside. "I cannot leave it," she said. The driver glanced at the sky. "Then you cannot come." The guard mounted his horse. The stage horses leaned into their harness, dragging the damaged coach toward the road. The broken wheel groaned and slipped sideways. Within moments, the coach disappeared into the snow. Eliza remained beside the drift. Jonah sat on his gelding and watched her. She had no horse, no heavy coat, and no reason to be standing in a Wyoming storm. Still, she did not ask him for anything. "What brought you here?" he said. "My mother died in August. The house belonged to my uncle. He sold it." "You have other family?" "No." "What did you plan to do after finding Samuel?" "Work." "At what?" "I can sew, cook, keep accounts. I taught younger children for 3 years." Jonah looked toward his ranch. The cabin stood beyond the creek, hidden behind the storm. For 7 years, no one had slept beneath its roof. No one had stirred the stove or opened the curtains. He could have taken Eliza to the barn and given her the bunk room while he slept near the horses. He could also have put her on his gelding and led her to Red Butte. Yet the road was closing. Night was coming. The temperature had begun to fall. Eliza lifted the trunk. "Can you tell me which direction town is?" "You will not reach it. I cannot stay here. No." She met his eyes. Whatever strength had kept her standing beside the road began to fail. Her mouth trembled once, then grew still. "I have nowhere else to go," she said. Jonah turned his horse toward the ranch. "Bring the trunk." The creek crossing had nearly frozen solid. Jonah rode ahead, breaking through the crust with the gelding's hooves while Eliza followed on foot. Twice she stumbled. The second time, Jonah dismounted and took the trunk from her. Neither of them spoke. At the barn, he led the horse inside, removed the saddle, and gave Eliza a blanket from a peg. She wrapped it around her shoulders while he lit a lantern. Then he walked toward the cabin. His boots stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. The door stood before him, dark and sealed, with snow gathered against the sill. He could still remember the last time he had closed it. The sun had been bright that morning. There had been dust on the road and wild asters near the fence. He remembered setting the key into the lock. He remembered thinking he would return after one night in the bunk room. 7 years had passed. Eliza waited behind him, shivering beneath the horse blanket. Jonah took the key from the cord around his neck. The lock resisted. He worked it gently until the iron turned. When he opened the door, cold air came from the cabin like breath from a cellar. The lantern light reached a wooden table, 2 chairs and a stone fireplace. A faded blue cup rested upside down beside the wash basin. Curtains hung stiff at the windows. Dust lay over everything. Eliza stayed on the porch. Jonah carried the trunk inside and set it near the table. "The chimney is sound," he said. "There is wood stacked behind the house. The pump is beside the barn, but it may freeze tonight." She looked around the room. "Where will you sleep?" "The bunk room. I can sleep there. You will sleep here." She pulled the blanket tighter. "Mr. Cade, I do not want to force you out of your home. I have not lived here in years." Her eyes moved toward the two chairs, the curtains, and the blue cup. Jonah crossed the room and knelt at the fireplace. Old ash still lay beneath the grate. He placed kindling over it with hands that had begun to shake. He told himself it was the cold. When the first flame caught, the sound seemed too loud. Eliza stood by the table, watching the fire grow. "I can leave when the road opens," she said. Jonah added another piece of wood. "We will speak about it after the storm." He showed her the bedroom, then stopped before the small door at the end of the hall. "That room stays closed." Eliza nodded. He found blankets in a chest and carried them to the bed. The mattress smelled of dust and pine. He could not look at the quilt folded across the foot. Before leaving, he placed a tin of coffee, a sack of flour, beans, salt pork, and 2 candles on the table. Eliza took the blue cup from beside the wash basin. She wiped the dust from its rim with her sleeve. "Thank you," she said. Jonah stepped onto the porch. The wind drove snow across the yard, hiding the barn behind a curtain of white. He closed the door, but he did not lock it. By morning, the storm had buried the porch steps. Jonah dug a path from the barn to the cabin before feeding the animals. When he returned carrying a bucket of milk, smoke rose from the chimney. He stopped in the yard and stared at it. The thin gray line bent beneath the wind, broke apart, then rose again. He left the bucket beside the door and walked away before Eliza could see him. An hour later, he returned from the east pasture and found the bucket empty. In its place sat a plate covered with cloth. Beneath it were 3 biscuits, still warm. Jonah ate them standing inside the barn. The storm lasted 2 days. Eliza remained in the cabin. Jonah brought wood, water, and food. She left meals on the porch without knocking on the bunkroom door. The plates were never large, and nothing was wasted. On the 3rd morning, the sky cleared. The world had become white and sharp. Sunlight struck the snow so brightly that Jonah's eyes watered when he stepped outside. Eliza was already in the yard. She wore Samuel's old coat, which Jonah had left on the porch during the night. The sleeves were too long. She had rolled them above her wrists. She held a shovel. "You will tire before noon," Jonah said. "The chickens cannot reach their feed." Jonah looked toward the small hen house. She had cleared half a path through the drift. He took the shovel from her. Eliza did not argue. She walked behind him, pushing loose snow away with her boots. When the path was open, she scattered grain for the hens. One pecked at the hem of her skirt. She bent and lifted it carefully, holding the bird against her coat. Jonah had never seen that hen allow anyone to touch it. Over the next week, the road remained closed. Eliza cleaned the cabin slowly. She did not empty drawers or move furniture without asking. She wiped dust from the windows, washed the table, and beat the rugs against the porch rail. The blue cup stayed beside the wash basin. Jonah noticed that she always left one chair untouched. It was the chair nearest the fireplace, with a smooth place worn into one arm. She used the other. When the road finally opened, Jonah rode into Red Butte. He returned with a spool of thread, lamp oil, and a small paper parcel. Eliza stood near the stove when he entered the cabin. It was the first time he had crossed the threshold since the night of the storm. He placed the parcel on the table. Samuel's things. Her hands stopped over the bread dough. Inside were a folding knife, a belt buckle, 2 letters, and a small photograph of Eliza and her mother. The picture had been folded down the middle and softened at the edges from being handled. Eliza touched Samuel's face with one flour-covered finger. "You said he was not alone. He rode in my wagon. Was he afraid?" Jonah considered lying. "No." She nodded, accepting the answer. "He spoke about you," Jonah continued. "Said you made better biscuits than anyone in Missouri." Eliza looked at the pan beside her. "These are not my best. They will do." A small sound escaped her. It was not quite laughter, but it changed the room. Jonah remained for supper. They sat at opposite ends of the table. Eliza served beans with salt pork and placed the biscuits between them. The fire cracked softly. When Jonah finished, he carried his plate to the basin. "You do not have to wash that," she said. "I know." The next evening he returned. By December, a rhythm had formed between them. Jonah rose before dawn. Eliza lit the cabin stove when she saw the lantern moving in the barn. He left milk and eggs on the porch. She left coffee inside a covered pot near the door. At first he drank it outside, then the mornings grew colder. One day he stepped inside without knocking. Eliza was kneading dough at the table. She slid a cup toward him without looking up. Jonah drank the coffee beside the stove. The next morning, he sat in the untouched chair. Eliza noticed but said nothing. She repaired the tear in his winter coat. He replaced the broken clasp on her trunk. She patched the barn curtains that kept wind from the stalls. He built a wooden box for her sewing supplies. People in Red Butte heard that Samuel Warren's sister was living at Cade Ranch. Mrs. Bell, who ran the hotel kitchen, sent 2 dresses that needed new hems. The blacksmith's wife sent a coat with a torn lining. Eliza worked beside the cabin window and saved every coin in a jar beneath her bed. Jonah found more cloth in town. He claimed it had been sold cheaply. Eliza knew that was not true, but she accepted it. On Sundays, the work slowed. They ate breakfast after sunrise. Jonah read old newspapers brought from town. Eliza wrote letters for 2 neighboring ranch hands who had never learned to write well. Sometimes they spoke about Missouri. Sometimes Jonah told her which clouds meant snow and which meant only wind. He never spoke of the cabin. Eliza did not ask. Near Christmas, Jonah found her standing behind the barn, looking north. She held Samuel's knife. "There is a hill beyond that ridge," Jonah said. "He is buried there with 2 other men from the drive." "Can we go? The snow is too deep." "When it thaws?" "Yes." She closed the knife. "Thank you." On Christmas morning, Jonah found a pair of gloves hanging outside the bunk room. Eliza had made them from a piece of deer hide and lined them with wool. He wore them every day. He gave her a small iron key. It fit the cabin door. Eliza turned it over in her palm. "You may need to lock it when I am away," he said. She looked toward the porch. The cabin door had not been locked since the night she arrived. Still, she tied the key to a piece of string and wore it around her neck. January brought harder cold. The creek froze to the bottom. Fence posts split in the night. A young steer broke through the ice near the spring and cut its leg. Eliza held the lantern while Jonah cleaned the wound. The animal kicked once, nearly striking her. "Stand back," Jonah said. She stayed where she was and kept the light steady. The steer survived. Afterward, Jonah washed the blood from his hands at the pump. His fingers were stiff, and he could not work the soap. Eliza took it from him. Without speaking, she poured warm water from a kettle while he scrubbed. The gesture was ordinary. It also frightened him more than the storm had. That night, he did not go to the cabin for supper. Eliza brought a covered plate to the bunk room. She set it on the step and walked away. Jonah watched through the small window until the cabin door closed behind her. He told himself that she would leave in spring. Each week, the jar beneath her bed grew heavier. Each week, the thought of her leaving became harder to hold. The change came during a thaw in February. Warm wind moved down from the mountains, softening the snow on the cabin roof. Water slipped beneath a loose shingle and began dripping into the hall. Eliza placed a basin beneath it. When the leak spread, she climbed onto a chair and pressed a cloth against the ceiling. The plaster cracked beneath her fingers. Water ran toward the small room at the end of the hall. She remembered Jonah's warning. The door stays closed. Then she saw water spreading beneath it. Eliza set down the basin and opened the door. The room was narrow and dim. A cradle stood beneath the window. Beside it was a small chest, a rocking chair, and a shelf holding 3 folded blankets. A woman's shawl hung from a peg. Dust covered everything except the floor near the door, where water had begun to gather. Eliza moved the chest away from the wet wall. The lid slipped open. Inside lay 2 tiny shirts, a knitted cap, and a pair of woolen shoes no larger than her palm. She heard boots in the hall. Jonah stood in the doorway. His face changed when he saw the open chest. Water dripped between them. "The roof was leaking," Eliza said. "I was trying to keep these dry." Jonah looked at the cradle. "You had no right. I know what you told me, but the water was coming through. You had no right to open that door." Eliza stepped away from the chest. "I am sorry." Jonah crossed the room and closed the lid. His movements were stiff and careful. Eliza picked up the basin. "I did not mean to disturb anything." He turned toward her. For a moment she thought he would say something more. Instead, he walked outside. The roof was repaired before dark. Jonah did not come inside for supper. He did not come the following morning. For 4 days he left food and wood on the porch without speaking to her. When Eliza went to the barn, he found work in the pasture. When she waited beside the pump, he entered through the rear stall. The silence between them was different now. Before, it had been a shared thing, quiet and easy. Now, it belonged only to him. On the 5th day, Eliza rode into Red Butte with the neighboring rancher's wife. Mrs. Bell offered her work in the hotel kitchen beginning in March. The pay was low, but a small room above the pantry came with it. Eliza accepted. She bought a length of rope and tied her trunk closed. When Jonah came to supper that evening, the sewing box was gone from the window. He noticed the rope around the trunk. "You are leaving." "Mrs. Bell has given me work." "When?" "Next Monday." The spoon in Jonah's hand remained above his plate. "The road may turn bad. Mr. Foster is taking a wagon into town." Jonah placed the spoon down. "You will be safer there." Eliza looked at him. "Yes." He finished eating, washed his plate, and left. The following days passed with careful politeness. Eliza packed her clothes. She returned the flour bin to the shelf where she had found it. She washed the curtains and folded Samuel's coat into the trunk. The cabin began to look empty again. Jonah slept badly. He heard every sound in the barn. Horses shifting, boards shrinking in the cold, wind pushing against the roof. He remembered the cabin before Eliza came. He had believed the silence protected him. Now he understood that it had only kept him from hearing what he had lost. On Sunday night, snow began falling again. It came softly at first, then thickened before dawn. By sunrise, the road had disappeared beneath 6 inches of new snow. Mr. Foster arrived with his wagon shortly after noon. Eliza carried her trunk onto the porch. Jonah stood near the barn with one hand on the fence rail. He had not offered to help her. He had not asked her to stay. Mr. Foster loaded the trunk and covered it with canvas. Eliza locked the cabin door. She walked across the yard and held the key out to Jonah. He looked at it resting in her palm. "You keep it," he said. "It is yours. You may need it." "For what?" Jonah had no answer. Eliza closed her fingers around the key. "Goodbye, Mr. Cade. Goodbye, Miss Warren." She climbed onto the wagon seat. The horses started south. Jonah watched until the wagon reached the creek crossing. The canvas over Eliza's trunk was the last thing he could see before the snow swallowed it. He remained beside the fence long after she was gone. Near dusk, the wind changed. It turned east and began driving the snow hard across the range. Jonah went into the barn and checked the horses. He added feed, closed the upper doors, and hung blankets along the stalls. Then he noticed the empty hook beside the harness rack. Mr. Foster's spare trace chain was still there. He had meant to take it. Jonah stepped outside. Snow had already filled the wagon tracks. The road to Red Butte crossed a low wash 3 miles south of the ranch. During heavy snow, drifts gathered there, faster than anywhere else. Jonah saddled the bay gelding. He found the wagon less than 2 miles from the creek. One wheel had slipped from the road into the wash. The horses were exhausted from pulling against it. Mr. Foster stood waist-deep in snow, trying to dig them free. Eliza was beside the wagon, holding a blanket around her shoulders. Jonah dismounted. "Take the horses loose," he told Foster. "We can get the wheel up, not before dark. The wagon stays here then." Jonah looked at Eliza. She had snow in her hair. Her lips had gone pale. "You are coming back," he said. Her expression did not change. "Until the storm passes?" He pulled the trunk from beneath the canvas. "We will speak when we are inside." They led the horses north. The return took nearly 2 hours. By the time the ranch appeared, the sky was black and the lantern near the barn door burned like a single yellow star. Jonah carried Eliza's trunk to the cabin. He set it on the porch. Eliza stood behind him, waiting. The door was locked. Jonah looked at her. She took the key from beneath her coat and placed it in the lock. Inside, the cabin was colder than the barn. Eliza went to the fireplace. Jonah brought wood from the stack. Neither spoke until the flames began to catch. Then Eliza removed her wet coat. "I will leave when the road clears," she said. Jonah stood with his back to the fire. "You do not have to. You said I would be safer in town. I was wrong." She hung the coat beside the stove. "About the road. About wanting you gone." Eliza faced him. The fire settled behind the grate. Snow struck the window in dry bursts. Jonah looked toward the hallway. "My wife's name was Ruth," he said. Eliza waited. "We had been married 11 months. The child came early. The doctor was in Cheyenne." His hands closed at his sides. "The baby lived one night. Ruth lived until morning." Eliza lowered her eyes. "I am sorry. I carried them out of this house. Afterward, I slept in the barn because I could not bear the quiet. Then the quiet became the only thing I understood." Eliza looked toward the closed room. "I should not have opened the door. The roof was leaking. You told me not to. I was not angry about the door." His voice roughened. "I was angry because you moved that chest as if the things inside still mattered. I had left them there to become dust." Eliza said nothing. Jonah walked to the table and placed both hands on its worn edge. "When you came, I opened this house because Samuel would have done the same for me. That is what I told myself. And now?" He looked at the flour tin on the shelf, the curtains she had washed, the blue cup near the basin, her coat steaming beside the stove. "Now I know I kept opening the door because I wanted you inside." Eliza's face remained still, but her eyes shone in the firelight. "You stopped speaking to me. I thought if you left angry, it would be easier." "For whom?" "For me." She nodded once. That part worked. Jonah looked down. "I do not know how to ask someone to stay." "Then speak plainly." He lifted his eyes. "Stay." Eliza waited. The word hung between them, too small to carry everything beneath it. "Stay for the winter?" she asked. "No." "Until spring?" "No." The wind shook the cabin wall. Jonah stepped closer, though several feet still remained between them. "Stay as long as you choose," he said. "Stay because this is your home, if you can bear for it to be." Eliza touched the key at her neck. "And if I open the wrong door again, I will try not to close it." She looked toward the hallway. "Ruth should not have to disappear for me to live here." Jonah's breath caught. She will not. Neither should Samuel. No. Eliza moved to the table and untied the rope around her trunk. Jonah watched her loosen the first knot. Then she looked at him. "I have spent most of my life staying where I was tolerated," she said. "I will not do that again." "You are not tolerated. What am I?" The answer came slowly, but it came without fear. Wanted. Eliza closed her eyes. When she opened them, she placed the cabin key on the table between them. Not to return it, only to let him see that it was there. The storm continued through the night. Jonah slept in the cabin for the first time in 7 years. He lay on a blanket near the fire while Eliza used the bedroom. The floor was hard, and the wind found a crack beneath the door, but Jonah did not sleep badly. The house made sounds he had forgotten, logs shifting in the cold, the kettle settling on the stove, floorboards answering footsteps in the hall. Before dawn, he woke to the smell of coffee. Eliza sat at the table, sewing by lamplight. Her trunk stood open beside her. Jonah pushed himself upright. "The snow has not stopped," he said. "I noticed. Foster will have to stay in the bunk room another night. There are worse places." Jonah looked around the cabin. "Yes," he said, "there are." When the thaw finally came, they rode north together. The hill where Samuel lay was covered in thin spring grass. Meltwater ran between stones, and meadowlarks called from the fence posts. Eliza knelt beside the wooden marker. She placed Samuel's knife at its base, then changed her mind and picked it up again. "He would tell me not to waste a good knife," she said. Jonah almost smiled. "He would." She slipped it into her pocket. They remained on the hill until the wind turned cool. On the ride home, Eliza's horse moved close beside Jonah's. Their knees nearly touched, neither pulled away. The back room of the cabin was opened in May. Jonah carried the cradle into the loft and wrapped it carefully in canvas. Eliza washed the shelves and moved her sewing table beneath the window. Ruth's shawl stayed on its peg. The small chest remained against the wall. Some evenings, Jonah stood in the doorway and watched Eliza work. She never closed the lid when she was in the room. By summer, people began riding out from Red Butte to bring her sewing. Mrs. Bell sent flour. The blacksmith's wife sent apple preserves. Mr. Foster repaired the porch rail in payment for Eliza mending 3 shirts and a winter coat. The cabin filled slowly. A second blue cup appeared near the wash basin. Jonah built shelves beside the fireplace. Eliza planted beans near the creek. Samuel's knife hung from a peg by the door, ready whenever either of them needed it. In September, Jonah and Eliza stood beneath the cottonwoods with the Red Butte preacher and 6 neighbors. There were no flowers except the late sunflowers Eliza had cut from the creek bank. Jonah wore the coat she had repaired during the winter. Eliza wore a gray dress she had made herself. When the preacher finished, Jonah took her hand. He held it as carefully as he had once held the cabin key. That evening, cold rain crossed the range. Jonah brought the horses into the barn, while Eliza covered the garden. They finished after dark and walked back through the wet yard together. At the porch, Jonah reached for the door. Eliza stopped him. "I remember standing here that first night," she said. "So do I. I thought you were opening the cabin because you pitied me. I thought so too." She smiled and leaned her head briefly against his shoulder. Jonah opened the door. Warm light spilled across the porch and onto the rain-dark ground. The table was set for 2. Coffee warmed on the stove. Beside the fireplace, 2 chairs stood close enough that their arms nearly touched. They went inside together. Then Jonah closed the door against the cold.